Okay. Um, I just want to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I'm currently situated here today in Melbourne, Australia. It's actually really important that whenever we have formal events that we do give our respect to elders past, present and emerging, and recognise that the Aboriginal people are the traditional owners of the land in Australia. So I'd like to start by having that formal acknowledgement before we begin. So thank you for the opportunity to talk on this important topic of women entrepreneurs and resilience. And I have to say that the past 2 years have been quite a booming business for me giving talks on resilience and the like. And we've learned a lot about not just resilience overall, but specifically how women entrepreneurs are navigating these difficult waters that we find ourselves in. So if we could move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So I just wanted to contextualize what the state is around the world for women entrepreneurs. So as you're all well aware, the MasterCard Index of Women Entrepreneurs collects this data in order to benchmark and rank the entrepreneurship environments and ecosystems and the level of support that we have for women entrepreneurs. So I just wanted to highlight a few key bits of information that may inform later discussions. First of which is that 51 countries saw decreased entrepreneurial activity during the pandemic. This was something that was very prevalent in Australia due to quite hard lockdowns. And I myself are located in Melbourne, and we received the dubious award of the most locked down city in the world, spending over 260 something days not being allowed to go out for more than 1 hour a day. So it's unsurprising that entrepreneurial activity decreased in cities like Melbourne. Overall, there has been impact on entrepreneurial activity, and that's not anything new, but what I wanted to highlight is that it has slightly disproportionately impacted women more than men. And one of the reasons around this is because of the increased caring responsibilities, not just for families, but also the emotional labour required that often falls to women during times of crisis and upheaval. The third point is not particularly new, but is worth noting, and that 80% of women-owned businesses around the world that have significant credit needs are either unserved or underserved. And I'm going to pick up on this and see this as an opportunity as well as a challenge in a few minutes. 14 economies saw increased women's entrepreneurial activity during the pandemic. So even though we saw decreases overall, in some instances in some countries, particularly in some Latin American nations, had more increases. And in 10 of these economies, women's entrepreneurship is greater than their male counterparts. So we are having overall improvement, which is wonderful. 80% of women entrepreneurs in Vietnam, Thailand, Costa Rica, and Nigeria are opportunity driven. So I just wanted to highlight this particular example to make us understand that when we talk about women and entrepreneurship, it's often considered in a very monolithic way, rather than realizing that there are so many contextual variables that give rise to different rates of entrepreneurial activity and success. And I thought it was interesting for us to at least acknowledge that in these particular contexts, opportunity-driven entrepreneurship, as opposed to, for example, needs-driven entrepreneurship, is something that exists. Australia is ranked 4th globally for best places for women entrepreneurs. And I said that I find this a little bit depressing because I do have to say that I don't really feel as if women entrepreneurs are that particularly well supported in Australia. Things are definitely improving, but I'd be happy to talk a little bit more about the context for women entrepreneurs in Australia and why we may be perceived as ranked so highly from the outside. But in practice, I think, you know, surveys like this are incredibly useful for us to do benchmarking, but they are very much an overarching view. And thinking about the context that we all find ourselves in here, in that Southeast Asia and the Pacific, are seen to have the most supportive conditions for women-owned businesses. So that means that for all the women who are entrepreneurs or would like to consider being entrepreneurs, then we find ourselves in an environment where we are more likely to succeed than some of our counterparts in other contexts. So I just wanted to lay the scene a little bit because we need to understand these issues before we talk about resilience. So if we could go to the next slide. So when we look at women and resilience and entrepreneurial resilience, I want us to just really focus on what it means, because when we use terms like resilience and we have increased usage of terms like resilience, we often ascribe our own personal meaning, and resilience can mean different things to different people. So I just wanted to pick up on the American Psychological Association's definition, which is a process of adequate adaptation in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, or significant stresses. And it's usually operationalized in research by picking up on the measures hardiness, resourcefulness, and optimism. So that's the way in which we commonly operationalize resilience, even though we have these day-to-day working definitions of resilience that tend to have more power for us and our own personal understanding rather than the textbook or the academic definitions. But when we talk about resilience, we often just focus on this one aspect of an overall process, essentially, because resilience is the act of overcoming. And since it's an act, we need to take this process point of view and realize that when the process starts for resilience to be exercised, we come at this from different places of vulnerability. So vulnerability is the extent to which we're exposed to shocks and risks and the difficulties we face in coping with them. So for some people to have greater resilience, it often means that you have greater vulnerability and have successfully overcome it. But when people aren't able to effectively act in a resilient way, we need to actually go back to see, well, what are the underlying vulnerabilities? And when we look at women in entrepreneurship, and if we, for example, overlay the understanding that 80% of women's businesses are underserved in terms of credit, then we can say that women entrepreneurs overall are a more vulnerable cohort when compared to their male counterparts. So when we think about this even further, realizing that it's about having the adequate adaptation. And when we talk about adequate adaptation, I actually like to use the term adaptive capacity. So I've popped a reference up there by Korber and McNaughton that looks at 6 different streams of entrepreneurship and resilience scholarship. And one of the themes that they have is looking at the macro lens of adaptive capacity. And admittedly, adaptive capacity as a concept has come from climate science. So we're looking at macro systemic community, social oriented change and adaptation and resilience. However, we can actually understand this at the individual level as well. So when we look at resourcefulness, we look at other concepts like psychological capital as well, but there are other different types of capitals that we need to take into account when we look at our adaptive capacity, particularly for women entrepreneurs. And that's where my research is sitting at the moment, because we need to look at the extent to which women's psychological capital, their human capital, financial capital, social capital, how they are all interrelated to determine whether or not there are sufficient capitals to assist in overcoming the inherent greater vulnerabilities that come with being a woman entrepreneur. So if we could move to the next slide, thank you. So the implications with knowing the context for women entrepreneurs and then the concepts that I've just raised is that because women overall are inarguably more vulnerable members of society for many reasons, and are therefore put in positions where we have greater opportunities to develop and exercise resilience. So when we look at challenges and opportunities, I wanted to actually start off with the opportunity and frame it in a positive way, because as I had on the previous slide, optimism is one of the key variables, constructs that we use to look at resilience. So starting with optimism is something I think is apropos. It means that since women are more vulnerable, if we do overcome the challenges as entrepreneurs, we are actually building up more resilience than our male counterparts. So it's like thinking about physical fitness training. The more weight you put on yourself, the higher the speed on the treadmill, the more you're building up your fitness. And that works for resilience as well. So the more weight you have to carry in the world, unfortunately means that if you can, well, fortunately, it means that if you can overcome these challenges and hurdles, then you yourself will actually become a much stronger person as a result. But one of the issues that I've found talking about resilience in the past couple of years, particularly for larger organizations, is that everyone's pushing for individual resilience, but we're not talking about resources. So there's been many an organization, and I won't name names here, that have asked me to run workshops and seminars on resilience for their teams. And then I ask, well, what resourcing are you providing beyond me? And they'll say, well, what do you mean? I said, well, so you want me to try and motivate your team to draw on their personal reserves even more, but you're not actually going to resource anything around that. So you just want me to basically extract more capital from them without you having to do anything. I say it in nicer terms, but I'm just trying to be quite blunt in this context here. And in that instance, I said, well, I'd rather you take the money that you'd pay me and do something as a sign of appreciation or recognition for them, because that's actually going to have a greater effect than me talking about resilience to them. And the reason why I've told that story is that we need to realize that because women entrepreneurs are more vulnerable, if we don't provide the requisite resources, it means that overcoming those vulnerabilities will be so much harder. And we don't want women to succeed in spite of support. We want women to succeed because of the support. Because the more we, engage in the different types of capital through our entrepreneurship ecosystems, the greater the goodwill we will all have as interconnected entrepreneurs. So if we can move to the next slide, please. So I am, talking about this in a very overarching way. So I look forward to hearing any questions and also continuing with the conversations. But I'm starting by talking about, well, how do we look at challenges and opportunities for women entrepreneurs themselves? First of which is that unconscious bias is prolific in all contexts, particularly in entrepreneurship ecosystems. So there is an opportunity for senior men in entrepreneurship ecosystems to take on roles as champions, supporting women, because in any system that you're in, those in power, if they're not prepared to give up a little power or share their power with others, then changes won't happen. And that's something that particularly frustrates me, because there's a lot of effort given to changing women entrepreneurs rather than saying, well, how are we going to change systems to support, encourage, nurture, and be more inclusive as well? So we need to look at supply and demand factors. So this is a call out to male entrepreneurs saying that you need to be champions of change as well. You just can't expect women to do all of the work to change a system. The second one is that we can see things as business opportunities as well. So increasingly in Australia and in a lot of other contexts, there are more VC funds tailored towards women, but then we can also think of, are there ways to develop products and businesses that can go outside of traditional ways of providing credit to women entrepreneurs? And we've seen this a lot with microcredit and the like in India, but rather than saying, okay, here's not just understanding that women are underserved, understanding why. And if we can't change it, then let's go around it and think about alternative credit products and approaches that we can use. The third one for women entrepreneurs that I want to highlight is that work-life balance is an issue for all entrepreneurs, but disproportionately impacts women. And this means that there needs both changes to public discourse, but also private lives to support and encourage women entrepreneurs, because unless there are changes to the way in which we function in terms of, some social changes around these things that occur in both private and public spheres, then we're not going to have long-term systemic change. Next slide, please. So what are the challenges and opportunities for us as academics and us as researchers? First of which is that we definitely need more research on women entrepreneurs in general, but specifically on resilience. It needs to be intersectional and cross-cultural as well. There is rich diversity within all of our countries. And if we just take that national lens of women entrepreneurs in Australia, we're missing the fact that we have women of colour, we have culturally and linguistically diverse women in Australia, and those experiences differ quite markedly. And research does show us that in Western contexts, women of colour are disproportionately discriminated against in their entrepreneurial ventures. We also know that many women entrepreneurs need skill and capability uplift, particularly for resilience. And this means that us as educators, as scholars, as drivers of public conversations, as thought leaders, we should take responsibility. If we're not going to offer programs for women entrepreneurs, then we need to use our research for advocacy for women entrepreneurs. And the third one that I think is most really critically important to underpin all of these factors, and is why I was so excited to take up the opportunity to speak to you all today, and that many of these issues are indeed global. So we need to actually work more effectively across institutions on these important issues, so we can not only highlight what is specific to women and entrepreneurship in our nations, in our cultural context, but how we can leverage our expertise and manpower across countries to really support, nurture, and champion women entrepreneurs around the world. Thank you. Hopefully I've stuck to time there.